Good morning, everybody. I'm Kevin House, your worship associate this morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church on this fine Canandaigua day. We are a group of spiritual free thinkers who gather to celebrate life, build community, and better the world. Wherever you are in your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. Unfortunately, Reverend Eileen Casey Campbell is not available today. She has a stomach flu. So we will share her sermon that was recorded last week at First Unitarian in Rochester through the magic of the internet. This service is also being live streamed to our YouTube channel. We will plan on continuing with this hybrid worship services throughout the church year. So you can join us each week here in person, on Zoom, or later on YouTube. If this is your first visit, welcome. We invite you to sign the visitor's book in the entryway, and whether it is your first or your 100th, we are glad that you came. There are a few announcements to share with you today. Please wear a mask. Masks are available for anyone who forgot one. RE and child care will be provided this morning by Pat and Kaya Mells, and we will be collecting the cards for Joys and Sorrows after our first hymn. Please fill them out or type into the chat box on Zoom if you have something you would like to share. Are there any other announcements for the good of the community? As we prepare to be fully together, I remind you to silence your phones and devices. We now enter a space of worship. I invite you to join with me in our chalice lighting words as the flame is lit. We gather this hour as people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs, like this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, celebration of the life we share together.
And not, you might think, because the sanctuary. Please join. My name is Chris Dorso. I use he, him, and his pronouns, and I'm moving a little bit slowly tonight, or this morning, because I was out late last night at a concert with some of my fraternity brothers, as one does the night before church. And so, and there's not why we, no, not yet. So 28 years ago, spring, made a decision, as many young people do, that was more impactful than I could have possibly even imagined at the time, and that was to join a fraternity, and not for, which was hard for me, and not for the reasons that you might think, because at the time when I was in college, coming from a family of where alcoholism was rampant, I didn't drink at the time. And so college was really difficult at first, that challenge of going away and the pressure to go out and be social and all of that. And when my friend asked me, encouraged me to rush the fraternity, I said, I don't drink. That's not really my jam. And he's like, no, it's fine. Trust me. He said, I wouldn't ask you if I didn't believe. And so I went through the rush process, whatever, and I said, these guys are great. Like, they're really fantastic human beings. And so the night that we got our bids, there were 8 of us in our pledge class, and we sat in a classroom down at Geneseo that night, the night of bids, and we were all very nervous. We had no idea what was going to happen to us for the next X number of weeks of our lives. And we went around and we introduced ourselves. And so everybody introduced themselves, and it got to me, and I said, hi, I'm Chris, from Comac, New York. And a really interesting thing about me is that I don't drink. Cool, awesome, great, next. And it was in that moment that I realized that this group of guys that I was pledging to make that connection with had my back, and believed in me for who I was, regardless of whatever the stereotypical fraternity setup you might think. And that quite literally is why we come to church. Because here, we're not afraid to say the things that we need to say to make that comfortable space for all of us, for ourselves, for our friends, for our family. We need to be able to say the words that we need to say and know that this community, like my brothers, have our back. And we are here together to build something and to grow and to do good in the world. So with that, in the spirit of my adventure last night up at Photo City, I want you to reach out to someone who is near you and talk about the last musical experience that you had, performing, listening, attending, whatever, and share that and get to know each other a little bit.
Okay. Okay, everybody, I guess we'll roll into the first hymn. So if you're able, please rise in body and spirit for hymn number 391.
Okay, folks, and I'm just going to play a short little intro from that last sentence of calming my fears, quenching my tears through all the years singing. And then we're going. Here you go.
Good morning. I'm Eileen. I'm so glad to be with you this morning. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and unfamiliar faces. And now it is time for a story. This morning's story was written by Hans Christian Andersen, but probably originally came from a folk tale in India several centuries before he was born. So we don't want to give him too much credit. And I need to tell it. I need some characters in this story. They're non-speaking parts, but I'm going to need some help. So I need an emperor. And I think probably Reverend AJ is going to be our emperor. Yeah. Come on up, emperor. You look empirical today. And then I need a swindler, and I think Chris is gonna be yeah. And I need some help from some of you, 'cause we only have 2 folks up here. So I need an advisor. Does someone feel like, yeah, come on up. You could give really good advice, you look like. Although in this story, you're not going to. Okay, come stand up by these 2, spoilers. And then lastly, I need a child. And if you feel childish, you can stay in your seat and play the child. Barb DeLeo is gonna be our child. Okay, and the story begins like this. Once there was an emperor. Now, he wasn't a very good emperor, I'm sorry to tell you. He really felt bored with policy, and governance made him want to fall asleep in his seat, and he didn't care too much about the people in his court, and he didn't care at all about the common folk in his empire. What he cared a lot about was fashion. He cared about the trappings of being an emperor. He liked to look good. He liked feasting. He liked grand palaces and decor. He liked to wear all the latest fashions. That's what he loved about being an emperor. And so one day, a swindler came to town, as is wont to happen in stories like these. The swindler came to the palace to visit the emperor, and he made him an offer. He said, I have the latest technology in fashion, and I know how to make you a suit that is like no other. This is a suit of the finest fabrics, of the trendiest cuts. You will be an emperor beyond compare. Only here's the thing about this suit, it's magical. And only those who are worthy can see it at all. And the emperor thought to himself, I need a suit like that. If it's trendy and it's fashionable, I need it. But he was also a little worried, because he worried deep down inside of himself that maybe he wasn't really worthy. A part of him knew that he was not so great an emperor after all. But he said yes to the swindler. Please do, make me a suit beyond compare. And so the swindler went off to the royal tailor's shop, and he demanded gold to buy the finest silks and the finest beads to embroider into them and the fanciest looms. But instead of buying all those things, he shoved that gold right into his purse. And he just began running a loom with nothing on it. Because you see, the swindler was here to swindle. And he started weaving nothing at all. And as people passed by the tailor's shop, they looked in and they thought to themselves, well, it doesn't look like anything, but maybe as the suit grows, I'll be able to see it. Maybe then I'll be worthy. So they said nothing. And as the swindler worked and worked, the emperor called his closest advisor. He said, advisor, would you go and check on the progress of the suit? See what it looks like. And the advisor went. He was like, yeah, sure, whatever, I'll check for you. This guy had a heavy load on his plate, because the emperor, we know, he's not good at emperoring. So the advisor went to go check on the suit, and he saw nothing. But he didn't want to admit to his boss that he wasn't worthy. He couldn't say that. So he told the swindler, oh yeah, it looks beautiful. Good work, keep on working. And he came back to the emperor and he told him, it's looking great. You are gonna look great, and I think you should wear it your grand parade next week. And the emperor was like, all right, I can't wait. And so the day of the parade came. The emperor sent his advisor to pick up the suit from the swindler. The swindler handed him a pile of nothing, but the advisor pretended to carry it to the emperor, who saw it and panicked, because of course he saw nothing. There was nothing to see, and he thought inside his heart, indeed I am unworthy. But he couldn't say it out loud, and so he pretended to put on the suit of nothing. He put it on like it had a jacket. He did up the fake buttons, and then he went out to walk in the parade. And he paraded up and down the streets, and each person that he saw felt they could not say that they saw no clothes on him because it would mean they were unworthy, and everyone else seemed to be loving the emperor's new suit. And so they said nothing, and everyone else said nothing, until finally a little child who didn't know that she should say nothing shouted out, "Where are the emperor's new clothes? The emperor's not wearing anything." And once the child spoke up, then everyone felt free to say the same. "Hey, I don't see the clothes either. I don't think he's really wearing any." And the emperor, suddenly aware of his nakedness, ran back to his palace, ashamed. Thank you, helpers. You can go have a seat. So you might be wondering why we tell this story. And I think one reason we tell the story this morning is this, that when no one is willing to say the thing that is hard to say, it makes it harder and harder and harder to say. And if one person is willing to say the hard thing, then it makes it easier for all of us to say the thing that is hard to say, doesn't it? And this is the end of our story.
Hopefully that'll stay lit. We are a community that holds one another in our celebrations and in our pain. We welcome you to share your joys and sorrows by writing them down on the card you found on your chair and placing it in the basket when it comes by you, or by typing in the chat box in Zoom. Know that whatever your heart is holding today, whether shared or not, we are with you. Now is the time in our service to join together in the spiritual practice of generosity. Our gifts of both time and money support our church in its work. Each week, we would like to spotlight a group or committee and thank them for their gift of time. This week, the group is Soul Matters, small groups that meet monthly to discuss various topics. People interested in finding out more can contact Reverend Eileen. 1/4 of our plate collection for the frozen season goes to Climate Solutions Accelerator of the Genesee Finger Lakes region, an organization working for a thriving region on a healthy planet, achieved through bold, systemic climate solutions that promote prosperity and security for all. You can give to this morning's offering by placing cash or a check into the basket, or by one of the options on your screen. Please make a note that your gift is intended for today's offering. We now gratefully accept the offering. I'll briefly summarize the joys and sorrows. Our dear friend had a bypass surgery while out of town, an emergency bypass surgery. I'm in love with a cute Italian woman. I didn't write that one. Michaela writes, grateful for this community, especially thankful for Danielle and Tom, who do give and keep on giving and giving to our community no matter what. And a newly adopted dog is showing himself to us, and we love him, and he's part of our family now. Orrin writes, I did not get my tonsils out on the 10th when I was supposed to. I guess that's a joy, Orrin. Joy for the sunshine, great sadness for the people of Turkey and Syria. And celebrating birthdays this week, my daughter will be 32 and my grandson will be 2, and that's Gigi. I will now drop a stone for these and all the joys and sorrows left in the silence of our hearts. Whatever is in your heart today, we are with. At this time, if there are any children who'd like to go to childcare, please go downstairs with Pat and Kaya. Looks like they've left already.
I invite you to join me now in a time of centering, followed by some shared silence. Get comfortable in your seat. Let your shoulders relax. Perhaps your eyes are closed. Let's take a deep breath. As we prepare to enter this silence, I ask you to look inside, to remember a moment when you felt in your body nothing but wonder, joy, or playfulness. Free from shame or fear or guilt. A moment of pure joy in your body. And breathe. Breathe into that moment. Find the space in your body where that moment lives. Maybe it's the power in your gut, or a swelling in your chest. Maybe it's the dancing that comes to your feet when you remember it. And breathe that moment larger and larger until it fills all of you, pushing out whatever shame or fear or guilt maybe used to be there. Let's join together in silence now. Thank you, Pablo and choir. That was beautiful. So welcome to the second annual First Unitarian Sex Sermon. It's actually a bonus sex sermon because you get one from Reverend Sherry this year as well, you lucky people. A congregation willing to publicly talk about sex up to 2 times a year. Wow. And a content warning, just to begin. This sermon acknowledges the reality of sex, and will also acknowledge the reality of sexual abuse, particularly in religious communities. Even though we won't talk about either of those things with any specificity, I want to invite you to take care of yourself. If that triggers stuff for you that you're just not up for processing today, you can go ahead and mute me or take a step out and take a breather. Anyway, what it says about my reputation that I'm the person who's been asked to preach on this topic now 2 years running, I'm not trying to read too much into that, okay? Let's none of us read too much into that. Honestly, this is not a topic that I had really thought to preach much about until Reverend Sherry invited me to preach last year. They said, I think sex is something we should talk about in worship deliberately at least once in a while. And I think Sherry's right. Even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable, it's important to be able to talk about sex and to be able to talk about it in our church communities. And it can be pretty uncomfortable, right? Like, who's uncomfortable right now? You don't have to raise your hands. That's gonna make you more uncomfortable, I realize that. I'm not here to pretend that we're this like magically sex positive movement where everyone's resolved all our hangups and we can talk freely and frankly about sex. Even those of us who don't live with individual restrictive boundaries of sex as taboo, we all live with the deep and far-reaching societal boundaries around it. Religious communities and religious disciplines have always been one of the primary ways that we humans distinguish the sacred from the profane. In our communities of faith, we commit to ethical frameworks that set boundaries around profanity, around that which is sacrilegious or irreverent, that which threatens to desecrate the holiness or the goodness of this world. And like, we're cool with a lot here, but our religious community of UUs has its own versions of profanity. And I can tell you, as someone who doesn't even work here and yet has dropped many a curse word from this pulpit, it isn't the kind of profanity that's going to get beeped on television. But there are behaviors and attitudes that we set outside the boundary of us with purpose. Things like white supremacy, anti-pluralism, apathy toward the earth, most physical violence. We deem those to be profane. They interrupt our connection to the sacred. There are also behaviors and attitudes we deem to be profane without purpose, because unexamined yet deeply held cultural conditioning has told us to. And one of those boundaries that snuck into our religious consciousness is that sex is profane. In particular, sex with joy attached. I have this friend who often tells the story, does round about the start of elementary school. So her mom told her the basic nuts and bolts, if you will, of straightforward straight reproduction. You and Dad did this twice. So her mom held back a laugh and said, yes, 2 times. And like, it's cute, it's funny, it's a cute story. It's pretty indicative as well of how even progressive, aspirationally sex-positive people without restrictive religious boundaries around the sex education they want to offer their children know the discomfort of talking about sex. Even folks a generation or two or three removed from the stork and the cabbage patch of reproduction to a child, it feels like deeply difficult boundary breaking to say to them, actually, grown-ups have sex for a lot of reasons, and mostly it's just for fun. And if we're okay with talking about how sex works, just like talking about the fact that it's enjoyable, then I don't know if we can call ourselves sex positive, friends. It's sex neutral at best. And there's so much able to talk about sex in the context of pleasure, sex for the purpose of enjoyment. First of all, we lose out on a comprehensive education for our children and the children in our communities. A sex-neutral education where we're only comfortable enough to talk about sex as the business of making babies becomes a very narrow view of sex. We leave out most of the kinds of sex that people have and most of the sexualities present in humanity. And it's not just the children in our care who miss out. It's our own sexual selves as well. When we stop at sex neutral, when we can't break the taboo around having conversations about sex with joy as its purpose, we have worse sex. Maybe this is too obvious to be said, but you know what? It doesn't tend to get said from this vantage point very often, so here we are. When we're able to overcome the cultural conditioning that's taught us that talking about sex is not allowed, in particular, talking about sex with the context of pleasure is not allowed, we make room for healing the real trauma that a sex-negative society has caused to our deepest selves. And there's some real fucked up rhetoric out there. I made it 3 minutes, by the way. There is this viciously pervasive messaging in our society that has told us that purity, spiritual cleanliness, means not only not having sex outside of very restrictive, arbitrary boundaries around cishet marriage, but also not thinking about sex and somehow not causing anyone else to think about it. We also have this conflicting cultural tendency to commodify sex. So it's both taboo and valuable commodity, but never a source of embodied, or dare we hope, spiritual joy. Breaking that messed up boundary, cultivating an ability to be frank and forthright with ourselves about sex, gives us a path to healed and whole sexuality, I think. A sexuality that might be able to be integrated with our spirituality. Growing our comfort in honest openness about sex within ourselves, especially sex with the quality of delight and pleasure, gives us a path to honest openness with our partners, which again, feels almost too obvious to point out, but here I am. It means more enjoyable sex. When we can comfortably talk about sex positively in our intimate conversations and our casual conversations, then we hold the tools to make our sexual relationships more positive, more joy-filled, more healed and whole. An ability to talk relationally about the goodness of sex also means we get better at preventing and responding to the kinds of sexualized behaviors that are not good. When we're able to talk freely about sex, about good sex, it gives everyone around us permission to talk freely about sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. And I think that that's worth it. So I spent a good part of my early career leading sexual abuse and misconduct trainings for churches in a different denomination. And in my experience, a culture of open, unashamed, transparent communication about sex in general is one of the best antidotes to sexual abuse in a religious community. So when I'd give one of these trainings, inevitably church leaders would come in a little flippant. There tended to be a little giggly silliness at the start, a normal reaction to discomfort, and even some eye rolling, a normal reaction to required workplace trainings. And there was almost always a sense from these groups of leaders, of well-intentioned, well-meaning leaders, that this training was unnecessary for them. Of course, they weren't abusers, and none of their beloved fellow congregants were either. They knew those people. They loved those people. They trusted them. And if this is the first time you're hearing this, I'm sorry to be the one to break it to you, but abusers are virtually always people we know and love and trust. Almost always. We are not good at identifying sexual abusers. And it's not a fault of ours. Abusers groom their character witnesses as well as they groom their victims. They will, in all likelihood, show up in our religious communities, in every religious community. And we will, in all likelihood, not know who they are. The training I gave was not a training in how to pick out and circumvent sexual abusers. We can't really do that. What we can do is refuse to create dark corners where abuse can be hidden. What we can do as communities that care about protecting their most vulnerable people is speak openly and honestly about sex, to reject a culture of secrecy around sex that helps abusers hide. We can make it normal to talk about sex and to talk about how sex is and ought to be good. We can normalize good, joy-filled, open and honest sex, and in doing so, abnormalize painful, coercive, abusive sex. We can be the child who dares to say to the emperor, dude, you're not wearing any clothes. Our openness says to the abusers who are definitely among us, there are no shadows for you to hide in here. We will not cover your abuse with a blanket of silence, so don't try us. We are not the church, babe. Beyond our own communities, getting past our discomfort to talk about sex is also necessary for being able to talk about the fullness of sexuality and gender. We can't say to the world that all sexualities are good if we're not ready to say that sex is good. But that's essential for us if we want to be part of protecting safety, acceptance, and love for all sexualities and genders in our wider culture. And unfortunately, our protection is sorely needed right now. The ACLU is tracking 29 bills nationwide that would restrict gay bars and nightclubs and any location that hosts drag shows, even your local libraries, to prevent them from taking place in certain municipalities. More than 90 separate bills seek to prevent access to gender-affirming medical care for trans youth. Some of those go so far as to criminalize parents who acknowledge and accept their trans child's gender. There are 120 bills nationwide in process that would seek to cause harm to LGBTQIA children in their schools. There are bills that would limit bathroom access and extracurricular participation for trans kids, eliminates peer support organizations for queer students, and go so far as to silence teachers from mentioning that more than one sexuality exists. The state of Tennessee just turned down a whole bucket load of federal funding for HIV prevention, opting instead to use state funds so that they're able to direct them towards first responders, mothers and children, and victims of human trafficking. Even though the data show clearly that the most likely victims of HIV in the state of Tennessee are Black men who have sex with men. You see how this is about refusing to say that sex for the purpose of joy is okay. Even the abortion restrictions we see coming down across the country, as well as the overturn of Roe v. Wade, is in part about the refusal to say aloud that sex with the purpose of joy is okay. Famously, Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay bill proposes that teachers should not teach or talk about sexuality in school in ways that are, quote, developmentally inappropriate. The fine print of the bill is suggesting that legislators consider it developmentally inappropriate for children to know that queer people exist. And this pile of legislation is just the tip of a massive iceberg of growing sex-negative, anti-queer, anti-trans movements. Unless we think that these are red state problems that don't apply to us, a well-funded, well-organized right-wing apparatus has pushed candidates with exactly these platforms across New York State's local elections for the past 2 years. Last November, I had to attend a school board meeting in a town of Canandaigua, where my congregation is, with some of my congregants to speak out against a petition from local parents demanding the removal of all LGBTQ literature from the school library and the removal of support systems for LGBTQ students in the schools. Thankfully, the petition failed, but the sentiment of silence is here in our communities. One of the tools for dismantling this hate is the refusal to participate in silence, to heal the places in ourselves and in our communities of faith in particular, that bristle when we talk about sex and sexuality and the multiplicity of gender. And this is not an a-religious stance. If we are to be a religion with love at its center, then healing those wounds is an act of faith. The phrase "to know one another" is a well-known Bible euphemism for sex, right? To know someone biblically, right? But it comes about because the ancient Hebrew word yada, to know, means sexual intimacy between two people. But it's also the verb that's used to talk about closeness with God, to be known by God. There is this suggestion biblically that we could come to know divinity with the intimacy that is possible in sexual relationship, and that we could come to know one another as we are known by a love that leaves no one out. Now that's some biblical sex positivity, right? So let's not, friends, let's not allow the weight of our silence to prevent us from being deeply known and held by the love at the center of all things. If we can set that weight down, say the things that are hard to say, then our sexuality becomes part of an integrated spiritual life. Then we get to sit at the edge of that wellspring of joy that lives in us and be known. May it be so. Amen.
Our closing words. May we set aside the weight of silence so that we might truly be known. Please rise and sing our closing hymn, number 108. Please join me in our words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community,